Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with me, Jonathan M.S. Pearce, and an esteemed guest that I'm really excited to introduce to you if you don't already know her, or reintroduce you to if you already know her. We'll come to that in just a second. This is a welcome break from my brain being absolutely saturated and obsessed with global politics. So it'll be really nice to think about and talk about something other than Putin and death. I'm really excited to say hello to someone who is still a colleague of mine. We were a colleague when we wrote at Atheism together, but we never really crossed paths. And now we're writing at OnlySky together. So Dr. Jeana Jorgensen, or is it Jorgensen? Jorgensen. Of course, I knew that. Welcome. Would you like to introduce yourself to the audience and say a little bit about where you are at the moment?
Yeah, so I have a PhD in folklore with a minor in gender studies. I have been in higher education for pretty much my entire adult life. I currently live in Indianapolis, Indiana, and teach at Butler University. So in my academic life, I do a lot of research and teaching around fairy tales, gender, sexuality, urban legends, sex education, just all kinds of folklore, basically. I'm sort of a generalist. And I also have, as you mentioned, written for Pathos and now OnlySky. I am an atheist, agnostic, flavored type person. So I'm very interested in all the intersections of religion, folklore, belief, disbelief, all of those things. I also write fiction and poetry, and I dance and just try to keep myself busy.
You're everything to everyone. I love, yeah, that's a really eclectic mix of things. And when I was just YouTubing you earlier today to just get a flavor of previous interviews, the first few I could find were like you dancing, and I was like, okay, as fantastic as that is to see, it's not giving me much content about, but it's really interesting that you have all that wide array of interests. Do you find that those things intersect, like naturally?
Yeah, to some degree. I mean, I've been very much into dance for more than half my life, in large part because academia is so much, live the life of the mind, which means, your butt's in a chair and you're reading and writing all day. And that just doesn't work for me. So I really like to experience embodied things like exercise and dancing and so on. So in some ways, academia and dance are sort of at odds. Further, I mostly do a form of dance, Middle Eastern dance or belly dance, that's seen as kind of hypersexualized by a lot of people, and like it's not. It's folk dance from the Middle East and North Africa and other regions. So in some ways, I have to kind of carefully manage my image there because, again, academia is a little stodgy and prudish in that regard. Like, how dare you have a body and not just be in your brain all day? But otherwise, I do think a lot of my interests do intersect. I mean, I study culture. I like dances from lots of cultures. I like to cook and eat food from also lots of cultures. I use a lot of folklore in my creative writing as well. So there are a lot of connections.
Yeah. Oh, brilliant. So we share a stage at OnlySky, which is fantastic. Nice, exciting new platform and experience for us. Here's your here's where you are. So if you ever go to OnlySky, guys, you can just go down to the About Us at the bottom, and you'll find all the contributors, of which there are many. And you'll see with Jeana here that she's got quite, as you would imagine from what she's just said, there's an eclectic mix of content in the writing, and that's, I think, something that's great about OnlySky as a whole. What do you see your writing at OnlySky as? I mean, what do you like to take? What would you like to be at OnlySky, I suppose?
I think I'm still figuring that out to some degree. But I do like having a platform where I can write about all of the cultural issues I see. So right now I've been thinking and writing a lot about disability and about ableism and kind of how we see that reflected in a lot of policies around the pandemic and things like that. I've been thinking and writing a lot about gender, when we have gender essentialist views and who that hurts. So I've been kind of trying to do a bit more broad, like cultural criticism, while at the same time just writing about stuff that I like and that interests me. So I'm still kind of finding my voice there, but I'm
Yeah.
really enjoying it. So.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's interesting. You mentioned disableism and ableism. Is that anything you have a personal connection to?
Only to some degree. There is some disability and chronic illness among my family members, and so I would say I am currently non-disabled. But that's a concept I teach in my classes whenever I get the chance. In disability studies in the university, there's this concept called temporarily able-bodied, or TAB for short, and that says, we're all only temporarily living in bodies that function more or less. Death, disease, and disability come to us all eventually. So maybe as a society, we should be less ableist and less judgmental towards disabled people, and also just make access more universal for everything. So
That's really interesting. So I have progressive multiple sclerosis. So I'm technically disabled. Well, I'm disabled. And quite a lot of MS is about, not quite, MS to me seems about getting old really, really quickly, right? Which is like, when I say, oh, these are my symptoms, I'm speaking to someone who's a lot older than me. They're like, oh yeah, I've got that too. But for them, it's taken maybe 80 years to develop. And for me, it's like, yeah, pretty much came on straight away. And so that's a really interesting way of looking at it, that actually we're only temporary, but there's this kind of window of fitness, this Goldilocks zone. And then everything each side of that, we're either getting on the way to that or losing that. So
yeah, I agree. And in America, it's particularly bad, I think, for a lot of reasons, like, eugenics and things like that. But in the US in particular, there's this association of good health with morality, with purity, with all kinds of positive attributes that, like, being healthy, whether or not you have an invisible disability, or you're not disabled, is seen as a sort of goal to which we should all ascend, as though it's a moral good in and of itself, which, like, it's not. Like, you don't owe anybody to be healthy, and yet in the US a lot of the discourse is framed like that. So
that's interesting. I've never really thought about that. That's interesting. So to move this towards your sphere of most expertise, or at least one of your spheres of expertise, folklore, for the audience. Well, actually, no. Before we get to folklore, you're American, and for someone like me, being British, where we have the religion of apathy here, and everyone is by default kind of like non-religious in any meaningful way. But for people in America, the default for me appears to be everyone's had a deconversion story in their lives, because most people seem to be born into religion, and then if you're an atheist, you've escaped from it in some way. That's obviously a mass generalization. But for you, what's your story, and how did you arrive at agnostic atheist?
Yeah, so I don't have a deconversion story. So growing up, my dad's side of the family was Christian, and my mom's side of the family was Jewish. And um, my dad didn't really like religion because he's sort of more of a I do what I want kind of independent person. So he didn't like being told to go to church as a teenager. And so when he met and married my mom, it was like, okay, he'll put on a yarmulke at certain things and do whatever. It's all good. So he had this sort of like chill attitude. And then on my mom's side of the family, I would say we're more culturally Jewish than religiously Jewish. So there was never really pressure for me to go to temple or things like that. So really, most of the times I had set foot in religious establishments was when I was a teenager, and all of my friends were having bar or bat mitzvahs, or if somebody died and there was a funeral at whatever religious establishment there was. And otherwise, religion was just not that big a part of my life. So I was an avid reader from early on. And so I remember reading just world mythology and world religions and all the things, and then being like, huh, this one says it's true and this one says it's true. And they're saying contradictory things about each other, and that's kind of strange. I don't think all these things can possibly be true. Like, even if one of them were true, how would you know which one? Because they all say they're true. So I think that I had a sort of non-religious upbringing, for which I am grateful, because I think that the way religion is practiced in a lot of the US comes with a lot of baggage around gender and sexuality and ableism and all kinds of things. And so I didn't deconvert because there was nothing to deconvert from. I just kind of grew up kind of looking around and being like, okay, okay, I don't want any of that religious stuff, so I'm just going to keep doing my own thing. And, my family still celebrates both Christian and Jewish holidays. And I think it's more about getting together and having good food and enjoying each other's company.
So that's interesting that you mentioned your father, didn't like being told to do, by authority or authority figures. Was he sort of politically liberal?
Yes, both my parents are politically liberal. They both grew up in Los Angeles. They both protested the Vietnam War while in college. Sort of starting to paint a picture of hippie type folk here, and they're middle class. My mom taught special education for most of her career. My dad has been a property manager and businessman. So I wouldn't say that they were really rebelling against anything because that's just how a lot of people in Los Angeles are.
Yeah.
So.
Well, it's just interesting because the political psychology and moral psychology, people like Jonathan Haidt would say that liberals are summed up by being more having as part of their moral value system the openness to new experience, fairness, and lack of harm, but also challenging to authority as well. So authority is big for political conservatives, and that
Mhm.
purity, authority, and tradition. So as soon as you said he didn't like authority, I was like, well, there's your is that your classic liberal? And turns out that actually there is some truth to that. So
Mhm.
um, talking about folklore. So well, first of all, I mean, you've given a hint of how you got into folklore, which is through a lot of reading and being interested in the content of what you read, I suppose. Well, what drew you further into the world of folklore?
Yeah, so I did my undergraduate studies at UC Berkeley, and I thought, well, I want to be a writer, so I'll major in history or something and become a high school history teacher by day, writer by night. And then my very first semester, I took 4 classes: Intro to Cultural Anthropology, Intro to Religious Studies, Intro to Linguistics, and a freshman seminar on fairy tales. And by the end of that semester, I was like, I want all these things as one thing forever. And that's
Yeah.
kind of what folklore is. And much to my good fortune, there's a major folklorist at UC Berkeley, Alan Dundas, one of the biggest name scholars of folklore, like modern folklore studies. And so I got to study with him once I figured out what folklore was. And that really just put me on the path. I was bit by the folklore bug, and I knew I had to go on for a graduate degree. I mean, if nothing else, I will never be bored because folklore is present in every culture, in every time period, in every layer of culture, every subculture, everything. So it's just constantly around, and it's always ripe to study.
Yeah, so you've just reminded me of not to worry. So I'm just going to look at something in a book here, but in the meantime, how would you define folklore for the uninitiated? And when is something myth? When is it legend? When is it folklore? Because these are terms that we see sort of thrown around quite a lot, and sometimes synonymously. But how would you define them?
Yeah, so I really like the definition that my colleague Lynn McNeil uses. Folklore is informally transmitted traditional culture. So if culture is everything around us that we learn, that kind of maintains society and its norms and values, folklore is that slice of culture that we share, usually face to face, peer to peer, also online, that is not maintained by institutions. So it's something that we maintain out of social bonds with one another, something that we maintain because it's tradition that serves us in some way. Um, so again, folklore is all the cultural stuff that we're swimming in daily, that is maintained informally rather than formally. So that would include so many things: jokes, proverbs, slang and dialect and folk speech, myths and legends. We'll get to that. Other forms of storytelling, a lot of traditional crafts, traditional foods, customs, folk music, folk dance, folk medicine. So like tons
Wow.
of stuff is folklore.
So that's fascinating actually, because I wouldn't have naturally thought that, and I bet you get this a lot, which is I just thought folklore was all about the storytelling element of folklore, but actually it's all of these cultural elements that are so wide ranging.
Mhm.
Fascinating. I have to correct myself. Earlier, I said we haven't really crossed paths too much, and then as soon as you mentioned Alan Dundas, I was like, Alan Dundas. Where have I read about Alan Dundas? And it's a chapter that you contributed so brilliantly to. Not Seeing God, which is a book that I edited back
Right.
in our Patheist days, and you contributed a chapter to that, which is one of the early chapters actually. Probably something like not seeing God, but seeing folklore in the Bible.
Yeah.
Which is
Yeah.
seeing parts of the Bible as folklore. So thank you very much for that. That's a great book. Everyone should go and get that. Not Seeing God. So maybe we can talk about. Well, in fact, I don't know if that's a good time to talk about that. Which is, well, actually, let's talk about myth and legend. So what differentiates folklore from myth and legend?
Yeah, so the definition I gave of folklore, informally transmitted traditional culture, that doesn't contain any reference to truth value. So folklore is folklore because of how it's transmitted, not because of what's in the content of it, whether or not it's true or false, or whether people believe it's true or false. So some folklore is technically true, like some folk medicine remedies actually have curative properties, and we just haven't discovered them yet. Other times, folklore is patently false. So again, whether we call it folklore or not doesn't really determine its truth value. It's more about how people transmit it and why. So within this kind of broad definition of folklore, I would consider myth and legend to be genres of narrative. So those genres do have some relationship to truth. So myth is a sacred narrative told as though it's true. By the people who believe it. So a lot of what we call myth and folklore is earliest gods, goddesses, deities, demons, the first humans, the first animals, how the earth was formed. These sacred origin stories that, again, by people who tell them, like they're considered true by those people. To anyone else, it might be like, oh, I'm reading a book of world mythology. Cool. But to believers, they're often true, and they're often regarded as sacred and holy and stuff like that. And then legend is a genre of narrative also told as true, but more in recent historical time rather than cosmic way back when time. So there are a lot of like ghost stories that are legends, stories about witches and soldiers and stuff like that. Urban legends or contemporary legends, those are really popular genre of legend right now. And again,
I always assumed that legend had a kernel of truth at the beginning that was then embellished upon and morphed into basically myth. But whereas myth was just out of whole cloth type. But is that incorrect? I don't know.
that's not how I would use that language.
Yeah, I'd be wrong then.
Yeah, and then like the funny thing is that again, like the way that these words are used just really varies wildly. So the TV show Mythbusters, we're gonna bust some urban myths or urban legends. Like, well, that's not really how I would use that language, but people are using it, so okay. So myth and legend in the folklore review are both told as though they could be true or were true, maybe to believers. But again, myth is like religious and more cosmic, and legend is more recent, can be secular, or maybe not. And then folktale and fairy tale, those are the narrative genres that are like explicitly fictional. So if I tell you once upon a time, you're not expecting truth from me. Whereas if I'm like, my hairdresser's cousin told me about this one time, that's like the introduction to a legend, your ears are perking up because it might be true. It might have a kernel of truth. We don't know yet.
And it's going to be something exciting or weird. Yeah. So it's interesting when you learn about the original when you read the original source material for some of the very famous folklore stories that we have. And you find out that they're a damn sight darker and more sinister often than that which has been regenerated for the Disney generation. What I'm leading on to is a question that what's the purpose of folklore stories, particularly folkloric stories? Where do they fulfill a function? And then why are some of them so very dark where they are not now?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I love talking about the functions of folklore. So sort of, inherent to the definition of folklore is this idea that it's not institutional, it's not compulsory. Nobody passes laws saying that you have to use slang or tell jokes. Like that's just not how that works. So if folklore doesn't serve some kind of function or role in society, it dies. Like, and
This is
one
the
of the
basis of memetics, isn't it? Like, as ideas, that you know, if ideas don't convey some kind of usefulness or some kind of function, then they will just die out. Yeah, sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, no, yeah, and so we have this idea that folklore exists in relationship to its social context. It exists precisely because it's doing something for the people. And I think one of the places where we see this is joke cycles. So groupings of jokes about the same topic, and oftentimes they relate to current events. So nobody is telling Challenger jokes anymore. Nobody's telling Dan
You know,
Quayle jokes
said
anymore.
that, as soon as you said that, I went Challenger jokes, like NASA chat. That's so weird that when you talked about cycles of jokes that were kind of topical, my first go-to was Challenger joke. What does NASA stand for? Need another 7 astronauts, and all those things that went around. And I'm sorry, that's terrible, but you know, but that's I remember being at school and those came around. And of course, now you'd say that, and it conveys, you know, for most people won't even. They might remember, but if you're young, you wouldn't remember. You wouldn't know. So yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, you're fine. So folklore has to serve some kind of function, and a really famous folklore scholar, William Bascom, posited that there are 4 main functions. Folklore can educate, it can validate social norms and kind of why society is the way it is today. It can apply peer pressure and forms of social control onto people, and it can be an escape or an outlet or some way to address a taboo quietly or something like that. Release, wish fulfillment, all that stuff. And the assumed function of folklore too is entertainment. Like, one of my other colleagues defines folklore as artistic communication in small groups. This comes from Dan Benamos. And so, like, artistic, it's in the title, it's in the description. So if my students are writing an essay and they say the function of this fairy tale is entertainment, I'm like, okay, and you didn't tell me anything useful.
Yeah.
So most folklore, it's already what we would call marked off by some kind of texture. Like, there's some kind of feeling to folklore. Like, if I tell you, like, okay, a priest and a rabbi walked into a bar, I have kind of set this off as an expressive context rather than a daily communication. I'm telling you what to buy at the grocery store context. So because folklore is framed, it has sort of a texture or a formula or something that kind of introduces, hey, here's something special. Like, of course it's artistic, of course it's creative. We already know it's going to be fun and entertaining and witty or whatever. So what does it do under the surface? That's where we get to these other functions, such as joking about taboo subjects, for example, or making a commentary on gender roles or race or social class or religion or something like that, reinforcing stereotypes, challenging stereotypes, looking at how groups create solidarity and bonding. Folklore can be therapeutic. Like, it has so many potential functions, which explain why it sticks around.
Yeah, interesting. And you mentioned the validation there. To me, that speaks of etiology, which is like etiological stories are stories that are created to explain particular phenomena in whatever culture or in certain geography or history. And so, is that what you mean by sort of validating?
Yeah.
In a
Yeah,
sense,
that's
yeah.
one example. For example, a lot of societies have etiological legends about why there are certain rock formations. In Scandinavian countries, there's a lot of, the giants were playing a game and then the sun rose and turned them all into stone, kind of a thing. But also validating social institutions. This is why we have this religion. This is why we have the institution of marriage, stuff like that.
Right. Yeah, excellent. So it's a kind of like a post hoc rationalization of whatever phenomenon you're talking about. That's really interesting. We have this kind of understanding that, or some people have this understanding that Christianity is the default kind of religion or whatever. But where would you see folklore in Christianity or in the Bible? And how controversial is that to Christians, for example?
It's a little controversial. So my mentor at Berkeley, Alan Dundas, wrote a book called Holy Writ as Oral Lit, in which he demonstrated that many sections of the Bible are folklore, which again is not a true false judgment at all, but
Right.
rather saying this passed through the hands of human creativity. So you see in the Bible certain things that are like, oh, that's a folktale plot that's traditional to the Near East. We see it in other sources. Well, we see certain rituals. We see the number 3 popping up. That's a very folkloric, symbolic number. And after writing this book, Dundas got death threats because, again, people were
Really?
misinterpreting what he meant when he said it was folklore. So yeah, so in some ways there is a lot of folklore in the Bible and in Christianity. Other of my colleagues study what is called vernacular religion. So vernacular meaning of the everyday of the people. So in this sense, there's religion as it's passed down from authority. The holy book says do this, the priests say do this, but then there's religion as people do it in their everyday lives. Like maybe you celebrate this holiday with your family a certain way. Maybe in your region of the country, they observe a festival a certain way, or a prayer or a ritual a certain way. So vernacular religion is kind of where folklore and religion really meet and overlap.
And is it in a sense then religion is merely a sort of a label of size, but also establishment? Almost like, do you know what I mean? Like, it's a question of when does a cult become a religion?
Right,
It's just, they're the same thing. It's just like one is bigger than the other and more accepted, but it's more accepted because it is bigger. Do you know what I mean? It's just, so in a sense, is folklore, so much of this could just be seen as folklore, but it becomes religion when it's far more accepted by far greater people.
Yeah, and like institutionalized to a greater degree. So, things like holy books and the hierarchies of which holy person or whatever, that's very much like an institution. But then what people actually do, like how do you actually pray when you're at home? Where did you learn that from? You probably learned it from someone face to face in your family. That's what's kind of more interesting to folklorists.
Right, of course. Yeah. And I like something you said earlier about the Bible. I mean, part of the problem with the Bible, because you're right, it's so obviously folkloric. Even with my very poor knowledge about what folklore is, to me as an outsider, it's obviously folkloric. But part of the problem is this kind of idea of hyperliteralism that people have, where you have to find this truth in the Bible, which runs really contrary to the number of genres you see in it, and the number of genres you see in particularly the Hebrew Bible. Just means it's not all going to be true, because you've got proverbs, you've got obvious like mythological stories, you've got things that are passed from and you've got poems, and you've got all these different types of story. Just again with folklore, can folklore cover those multitudes of genres?
Yeah, many of them. Proverbs count as folklore. Lots of different types of storytelling genres would count as folklore. There's so much stuff out there we could, I think, productively label as folklore, because what we do when we study folklore is we look for multiple existence and variation. So unlike literature or pop culture text, like, you publish a novel, it stays the same. You produce a film, it stays the same in every viewing and every reading. Folklore changes in every telling and every iteration potentially. So, sometimes things stay a little closer to tradition. Other times there's more variation. But if you can document like multiple instances of something popping up and changing along the way, it's probably folklore.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I reading Jesus Before the Gospels, which is a Bart Ehrman book, talking about how Jesus, you find the Jesus in the Gospels, what happened from Jesus to the Gospels. And he talks about, passing on things in oral tradition, how Christians say oral tradition is so unbelievably accurate for the early Jews, and therefore these are really accurate. And he's like, well, let's look at some of these Slavic folkloric singers and telling tales through their music, and were they really interested in one-to-one accuracy? Like, when I sing this to you and you learn this song off me, is it about now repeat it to me? Is it 100% what I've just done to you? Okay, that's brilliant, you can go off and sing it. It's not. It's about a whole different process.
Yeah, exactly.
So there you go. So what is something I came across today, and I heard you talk about it in another interview you did, ATU, which is the Arna Thompson Index. What's the ATU, and how does that help with folklore studies?
Yes. So folklore studies is international in scope. One of the oldest versions of Cinderella is from 8th century China, for example. It's told in Germany, in France, in South America, like almost everywhere. And folklore is rarely universal. I have a lot of feelings about that term. But if you're trying to study something that is shape-shifting along the way, And the title is changing too. You know, Cinderella in English, Aschenputtel in German, Cendrillon in French, Yehsian in Chinese. Like, just how do you study this shape-shifting thing? So early folklore scholars came up with what we call the tale type index. It was created by Finnish scholar Antti Arne in the 1920s, revised by American Stith Thompson in the 1960s, and finally added onto by German scholar working with an international team, Hans-Jörg Uther. So ATU, Arne Thompson Uther.
I forgot
So
the U, sorry.
yeah, it's a recent revision. So it's this idea that we give stories numbers to kind of keep track of them. So numbers 1 through 299 are animal tales like Aesop's fables, so talking animals and stuff like that. 300 through 749 are fairy tales proper, so Cinderella is 510A. Little Red Riding Hood is 333. And upwards of that is sort of like everyday people folk tales, like stuff like you'd find in the Decameron and Canterbury Tales, like not necessarily a lot of magic, but, you know, maybe some stupid ogre tales, like, you know, Odysseus tricking the Cyclops kind of a thing. So yeah, it's this index. It's a reference work that we use to cross list and find tales. Like, oh, I saw this really interesting German tale. What other cultures is it told in? What are the main variations that we see? To again look at the function, like look at like why is it told this way in this social context? What is it doing for these people? So yeah, we are nerds. We give things numbers. There's also a migratory legend index because again, legends are also told, like there are a lot of legends, like the etiological legends, you know, the stones here are this way because blah, blah, blah. But like lots of cultures have those legends and the details will just vary according to the specific place where it's told. So we track those too.
Yeah, I mean, it was mentioned in the live chat a little bit ago, but one of my favorite examples of an etymological legend is the pillar of salt. Lot's wife getting turned into a pillar of salt in Sodom and Gomorrah, which appears to explain a pillar of rock that's actually in existence in the area, but also the saltiness of the Dead Sea that's local to that. And you know, you get these kind of you know, and I just think that's clearly an etiological tale that somehow become interpreted as actual history, and it's clearly not, because primarily it makes God look like a dick. But there you go. There are. I remember having my mind being pretty blown when I found out that Little Red Riding Hood. And you're probably going to correct me here because I'd probably butchering this anyway, but you know, Little Red Riding Hood, I'm sorry to pick a really common one and you'll be bored of talking about, but you know, the original one is really pretty sinister, and actually Little Red Riding Hood gets eaten by the wolf at the end of the story, and it's more about like the predatory nature of men outside and you know, wanting to protect your young children, particularly girls or whatever. I'm probably butchering that, but and then that's been morphed over time. You know, why do you think those sort of things get somewhat sanitized over time?
Oh, yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. So first off, we don't tend to say the original very often because, well, I mean, unless you have a time machine and you can go back to the first time something popped up in oral tradition, you know, the stuff just it spreads. So you might say, you know, an early version or the earliest known version. So the version you're referencing is Charles Perrault's Little Red Riding Hood from the 1690s in France. And like, yes, in that one, the wolf straight up eats the girl, end of story. It is very much a parable of sexual assault. But we have other versions, like there's one from maybe a century or two later, where it's also it was collected in France from kind of a peasant community, where the girl actually escapes. She saves herself because she's clever. And so in that context, it's maybe less about sexual assault and more about maybe a coming of age ritual. Because in that one, when she's going to grandmother's house, she meets the wolf and the wolf asks, are you taking the path of pins or the path of needles? And she answers one way, the wolf goes the other way. The wolf beats her to grandmother's house, kills grandmother, puts some of her flesh on the table and some of her blood in a jar. When Little Red Riding Hood gets there, the wolf says, as Granny, you know, eat some of the meat and drink some of the wine in the pantry. And the girl does. And then she basically does a striptease for the wolf by taking off all of her clothes and says, you know, what should I do with my apron? What should I do with my blouse? And he says, throw it into the fire. You won't need it anymore. And gets into bed with him. And they have the whole litany of like, oh, Granny, how big your arms are. Oh, it's to carry firewood and so on. Oh, Granny, how big your nose is. Oh, better for sniffing tobacco. Things like that. And when she realizes like, oh, Granny, how big your mouth is, better to eat you, she says she has to go to the bathroom to relieve herself. And the wolf says, do it in the bed, my child. She's like, So he ties a cord around her foot so she can go outside. And then she unties it, ties it to a plum tree, and runs all the way home and gets there right before the wolf catches on and is able to catch her. So in this interesting version of Little Red Riding Hood,
Wow.
yeah, I just take that in for a second. I love to inflict that on my college students. My colleague Ann Duggan hypothesizes that this is a coming of age tale in a rural Catholic French context, just as the tellers and audiences of this tale might be familiar with this idea of ingesting the blood of Christ in a church ritual.
Wow, yeah.
The girl ingesting the blood of Granny also grants her strength and wisdom.
Right.
The path of pins and the path of needles, she's entering womanhood when, in this context, women would be seamstresses. They would sew all their family's clothing.
Right.
So it's a tale of a girl like becoming mature and like saving herself and like going on to become presumably a productive citizen of her society.
Yeah. So we see this, and I spoke about there's a book, Myth Education by David Fletcher, that he's collected a bunch of, or he's interested in mythology, and he's written about all these stories outside of the usual kind of Greek and Roman pantheon. And we were talking in the interview I had with him recently about some of these, myths from in this case Egyptian mythology, and talking about how like just weird and sexual in nature, and you had sperm over whole fields of cabbage and stuff. It's just really weird. And I was talking about like we would never teach that to our children these days, but obviously in those days that must have been just like everyone knew about that, whatever. So I find that an interesting thing, and to just map it back to what you were saying about those two iterations of Little Red Riding Hood, that we wouldn't teach those these days in our kind of sanitized environment. What explains that, and what's gone on there? Is that just a reflection of society?
Yeah, well, part of it is that fairy tales have always been by and for adults. So this whole like child audience Disney thing is pretty recent. I'll talk about that in a second. But the earliest collections of folk tales and fairy tales that we have were actually written by like highly literate and intellectual people. So Charles Perrault, who had the sexual predator, Little Red Riding Hood, he was a courtier in the court of like Louis the 14th. Like he was a well-respected gentleman who wrote fairy tales because that was kind of in vogue at the time in the salons and stuff. Even earlier, we had we had Boccaccio's tales, we had Straparola's tales. They're both Italian guys writing in the 15 and 1600s. Again, like educated, literate people writing fairy tales. We had the Arabian Nights or the 1001 Nights from Arabic literature that kind of is hybrid folklore literature stuff. Again, like these are adults writing for adult audiences. And if kids happen to listen, okay, some stuff might go over their heads. So we really get the association of fairy tales with childhood in the 1800s. So the Grimm brothers, Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm, they were scholars. They were, among other things, linguists. If you study historical linguistics, you will know of Grimm's law about Indo-European phonetic change. So yeah, they were pretty serious guys.
I'll take your word for it.
Okay. And so they were collecting folk tales and fairy tales at a time, kind of influenced by the Romantic movement, by the sweeping waves of nationalism. Germany wasn't Germany yet. Napoleon was rolling through and wrecking it and stuff like that. So they thought, kind of along with all of their peers who were really into like art and music at the time, if we can collect folk tales and fairy tales that are Germanic in essence, we can prove Germany has a national identity and should be a country. So they released the first edition of their tales, volume 1 in 1812 and volume 2 in 1815, the Kinder- und Hausmärchen, or childhood and household tales. And they were really nerdy. Like they were like, here's a text and here's a bunch of footnotes and correspondences with my Italian colleagues. We found a cognate, blah, blah, blah. And then they realized that the tales were actually starting to sell and people were reading them to their children. And then they're like, oh, this does not reflect well on German motherhood, for example. Like in the earliest version of Snow White that they published, it was her mother, not her stepmother, who was jealous and wanted to kill her own child. Like
Right.
just things like that. So they started kind of cleaning them up, taking out they left in some violence, they left in some scatological references, but references to sex, references to bad mothers, like those became stepmothers, things like that. And so the Grimms really kind of started this idea that fairy tales are for children. They're interesting for scholars, but they're for children, and thus they should have healthy messages. And so that continued on into the Victorian era when a lot of folklore was being translated into English and being disseminated in children's books. And then that just kind of carries us on a wave to Disney of today.
Right, fascinating. And what's interesting when you talked about being compiled to represent some kind of German national identity, straight away I went to, well, the Bible being written, the argument that particularly from seculars, that the Bible was compiled in the exilic period when the Hebrew people were in exile in Babylonia, and they had all these, some of these stories and some stories from around them from the Babylonian culture, and they felt devoid of national identity being in exile, so they compiled the Bible, drawing on the culture within which they were set, but also from their own stories and different sort of elements of their own peoples. And then out of that came the Hebrew Bible, or at least the first iterations thereof, to cement some kind of idea of national identity. So it's just a weird parallel.
Interesting.
But anyway, just sorry about that, just banging on. So how might folklore then be understood in terms of the Bible, say, or Christianity? Or I know you've touched a little bit on that, but are there any other sort of parallels that we can draw in, maybe the transmission of the Bible, or any other kind of connections there?
Yeah, I'm not a Bible scholar.
No, it's fine.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting. I have other colleagues who study this a bit more. I know that there's a really, in some forms of like Catholicism, there's a really robust cult of the saints, for example, which is pretty interesting, which would kind of exemplify folklore. Because again, like, I don't think the cult of the saints is like technically in the Bible, but people do it. So that would be kind of interesting from a folklorist perspective. When people make altars at home, really of any religion, like, what's your inspiration for this? Like, where did you learn to do this? Like, how did you come up with certain symbols and things like that? Like, I think that's really interesting. So,
yeah, because actually there's this, I mean, the modern day human has so many influences because of the nature of being able to get information so freely from all times and places. You are bombarded consistently. So this must be a really interesting time for folklorists, because you're bombarded constantly with influences and ideas and stories and elements from all times and places. So you can just meld these all together and create your own kind of hybrid folklore, individual for yourself.
yeah.
And I presume that's what basically happens.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have colleagues studying some of that stuff. One of my colleagues is studying Wicca and neo-paganism, for example, which is very much like constructed belief system. I mean, really, they all are at the end of the day, but
Yeah. How do you think folklore has affected you, or has it affected you, as far as what have you taken from it? How's it changed you, if it has?
yeah. So I think folklore affects everybody. It's social glue. It's in all of our lives, even if we don't identify it as folklore using scholarly terminology. Um, so I think its impact on me is I interact with food in a very folkloric way. Like, I really love recipes from my family as well as recipes from other cultures. I just kind of really want to understand where tradition and food intersect, and I'm very much into that. I also I cook, I bake, I have a sourdough starter, I make pickles and stuff, sort of like traditional methods of preserving foods before refrigeration came along. I'm a little bit into crafts and fiber arts. So again, like, things like knitting, but before we had just go to a big box store to buy your clothing, where did clothing come from? People made it. mostly women made it. And this is kind of another connection with fairy tales as well. A lot of fairy tales are about spinning. And fairy tales were also told while women were spinning and weaving and doing all these kinds of things
Right.
together. So this is a very interesting kind of layering of all these elements and so on. And, if you know the story, Rumpelstiltskin, right? It's all
Well,
about.
that's obviously the first one that comes to my mind. It's like spinning, Rumpelstiltskin.
Yeah, well, there's actually the Grimms have a lesser known sort of variant of that called the Three Spinners, where this girl is lazy at home and doesn't want to spin, and her mom starts beating her. And the queen is walking by and she's like, "What's all this fuss?" And the mother is embarrassed. So she says, "My daughter is so industrious. She just won't stop spinning, and we're poor, so I can't afford things for her to spin." And the queen's like, "I'm into it. I'll take her. And if she spins really well, I'll marry her to my son." So you end up with a very similar setup of Rumpelstiltskin's kind of weird coerced thing. And this girl is crying in a room full of, I don't know if she's supposed to have been like flax or wool or whatever. And she's crying and crying. And these three ugly old women come and say, there, we'll help you. The condition is you must invite us to your wedding and treat us as your relatives. And she says, okay. And these women are just ugly and all this stuff. So they successfully spin this whole room full of stuff into thread or whatever. And the queen is delighted, and the girl's to be married to the prince. And so at the wedding, these three ugly old women show up, and everyone's like horrified. But she's like, "Hey, it's my aunties," and she invites them to come sit at the table. And the prince is like horrified but fascinated. He's like looking at them. He's like, "Okay, I have to ask," because like one of them has really giant feet. One of them has a really big thumb. One of them has a lower lip that just like hangs over half her face. And so he's like, "Do you mind if I ask you, why are you like this?" And so the one with the big feet says it's from treading the spinning wheel with her foot. The one with the big thumb says it's from pressing the thread. The one with the big lip says it's from licking to like thread the flax or whatever going in. And the prince is horrified. And he says, "My beautiful wife will never spin again." Which, of course, is a
Right.
happily ever after for her. She gets to marry
Yeah.
into royalty and not have to do this dreaded task. And this is one of our ideas about the functions of folklore is if, according to your society and your gender norm, you have to spend half your waking hours doing this kind of unpleasant, repetitive task, you really can't come out and say, "This is crap. I never want to do this again," because you have to. You have to clothe your family. But you can tell stories where someone is rescued from that fate as sort of an implicit social critique.
Yeah, and a kind of a story to give you hope that maybe you could win the lottery of life. So you've written a book about folklore. In fact, let me just share with viewers that book. In fact, no, I won't. I'm going to stop sharing and then share it properly. Oh well, you might as well just show that then. So, it's in hardback, is it?
Yeah, it's in hardback and paperback. This is the reflective one. Trying to get it to not reflect. Okay. Yeah, so this is Folklore 101.
Yeah.
It's well over 300 pages.
Yep, which I've just shared that there. So that has lots of nice reviews on Amazon. So people seem to like it, which is fantastic. So what were you trying to achieve with that book? What is it, a textbook or is it a general reading book or both?
It's kind of both. Yeah. So I was feeling not great about where my life has gone. I got a PhD about a decade ago and have been kind of floating around various part-time contingent jobs in the university. And I was like, well, what should I do? I guess I should write more and kind of see where that goes, because I was never going to really write an academic book without a reason to. I've published over 24, maybe at this point, almost 30 articles and book chapters of my research. And I'm only going to write an academic book if I have a tenure track professorship, because for those who don't know about academic publishing, you're supposed to spend 2 or 3 years of your life writing a book based on your original research, which cool. I'm into that. And it gets published by university press. And it's so expensive that maybe like 20 people read it ever.
Just
And you don't
annoys
get
the
paid
heck
for
out
it.
of me.
Yeah. And in academic publishing, you never get paid for your writing. You never get paid for your services as a reviewer or an editor. And I'm all for perpetuating knowledge, but I don't want it to all live behind a paywall after I've worked so hard. And so I've done freelance writing for years and years now. I've done various things, like I've done educational writing and I've done all kinds of stuff. So I was like, if I'm going to write a book, I want to at least like have a chance to make money and reach people. So the idea for Folklore 101 was born when I was kind of I was in one of these little like slumps, like, what am I doing with my life? And one of my friends who's a writer, she was like, look, just start writing stuff. Just go for the low hanging fruit. You've got a blog, you've written tons of blog posts. Find the unifying theme and just self publish them. Just put it out there. See if you like it. Start doing stuff. And so I was like, okay. It's like, well, I think I've written the most blog posts about folklore, so I should do that. And then as I started to kind of work on this idea, it just became obvious to me that there aren't that many folklore textbooks. There are a handful. They're pretty good. But they're usually not very public aiming. They're not like meant to be read by anyone and everyone. They're kind of like, for your university class on folklore, you will buy this book and read it and then like sell it back to the bookstore when you're done. So I really wanted to write something fun and engaging that would reflect my lifelong obsession with folklore and hopefully get to like share it with people. So that's where Folklore 101 came from. And I found a lot of really amazing friends in the self-published writing community. So people who would sort of like through the digital realm hold my hand while I was freaking out about some aspect of self-publishing. So it's through my writing friends that I met my cover designer and my editor, and just they answered all my questions. And so I've just had a really good time of it, and it's been a very cool experience.
Oh, it's brilliant, and and it looks like a really good end result that people really appreciate. So it's a quality piece of content at the end of the day. What's in it? Are you talking about different fairy tales? Are you retelling some? Are they a series of essays on particular ideas of folklore?
Yeah, more that last point. It's a series of short essays, and it's just like the conversation we've been having. What is folklore? Okay, well, what are the functions of folklore? Okay, well, what are some examples? What's myth? What's legend? What's fairy tale? So I kind of go through and give a bunch of introductory basic definitions. I've got chapters on the functions of folklore, and then I go into a bunch of genres. So myth, legend, fairy tale, they all get their own genre. Joke, slang, proverb, folk metaphor, folk simile, crafts and arts, all the way down. And then I have a couple or a handful of like kind of special topics like women's folklore, children's folklore. These are kind of established areas of study. Disability in folklore, which is something we've established interest in, and just kind of like other sort of like interesting topics. So I really view the book as, okay, you didn't get to take that folklore class in college that looked cool. Read this book. That'll kind of get you most of the way there. And then it'll give you some ideas for other stuff to research. If something really kind of catches your interest, you can like raid my bibliography and find some other stuff.
Yeah, and that's always, bibliographies should always be a nice little gold mine of where to take your rabbit hole sort of reading. If anyone has any questions or super chats, please get them in. This is going to be a short one tonight, so we've got about sort of 15-20 minutes left, so it'll be great to get some questions in. If you have any particular questions for Dr. Jeana Jorgensen, that'd be fantastic. What is your favorite geographical area, cultural area, country, whatever, for folklores? What is, maybe it's something that's particularly piqued your interest recently, or has always been your favorite?
Yeah, that's tough. Because again, I'm kind of a generalist, so
Right.
I really enjoy Scandinavian folklore. So I've taken a couple college classes on it. I just really enjoy legends. Like there are all these like Swedish and Danish and Norwegian legends about like witch butter, where like the witch is stealing a cow's milk and turning it into butter. You can tell it's witch butter if you stab a knife into it and the stick of butter bleeds. Just like sometimes.
Nice. Nice.
And I also am really interested in Middle Eastern and North African folklore, in part because of the music and dance connection that I'm already into. But I'm actually finally reading the complete 1001 Nights, or a near complete new translation. I'm really enjoying it.
Oh, great. Do you think certain cultures, I don't know, maybe with the kind of religious rigidity that they have, and I'm talking about Islam, I'm talking about fundamental Christianity, do you think that they are mechanisms that seek to, or whether intentionally or not, seek to stamp out sort of ideas of folklore that exist outside of their own sort of belief systems?
Yeah, I do think that institutions can kind of come into conflict with folklore, but folklore is like one of those really stubborn sprouts that comes up between the cracks in the pavement no matter what you do. I mean, the really interesting thing about the Thousand and One Nights, for example, is that one of the first full manuscripts emerged in the 15th century. It was a Syrian Arabic manuscript. But again, because stuff that circulates in oral tradition has to have existed for a while before it got written down, we think it's much older than that. There are references to similar tale collections from the 9th century AD. And there are so many kind of like bizarre things in the Arabian Nights. Like there's like orgies and lots of weird sex and just lot like nudity and like there's so much. You're like, this is not coming from a culture that is ridiculously repressive. The same way that a lot of people,
Yeah.
a lot of Americans will think of Islam as this like horribly repressive conservative culture, blah blah blah, all the horrible things. It's like no, it's like any other religion and culture. There's a lot of variation over time and space, and it's just so interesting to see that that you do see some traits of Islam in the Thousand and One Nights. So people are always there's a lot of prayer. There's a lot of kind of similar ideas about fate that you'll see in Islam showing up in these stories. But then they're also really raunchy. And so again, like I don't think that it's accurate to say that like religion, like strict religion and folklore are always going to butt heads. Like there's going to
Yeah.
be ways that they like work together in odd ways.
But I love that way, you talk about slipping through the cracks, because at the end of the day, a lot of folkloric transmission is going to be happening behind closed doors in like family environments or around a campfire or whatever. And out of the sight of maybe some overbearing institution or what have you. Yeah. So what would you say is your favorite folklore story then?
Yeah, I do have a soft spot for Little Red Riding Hood. That's just such an interesting one with all the variations.
I was going to say, is that because it has so many variations? Is that because?
Probably, yeah. So right now, actually, I'm teaching a class that's like an upper division anthropology class about sex education and culture. And so we've been reading a lot of great folklore texts because, again, like in the US, at least, where sex education as an institution is lacking for a lot of reasons, people will circulate folklore about sex to try to fill in some of those gaps. So some of my favorite texts right now are these folk belief or superstitions about like, well, if you have sex unprotected, but you jump up and down, you won't get pregnant. Or if you douche with soda afterwards, you won't get pregnant, and things like that. And I'm just like, I see why this is happening, but also that's inaccurate, and douching is really bad for you. So it's really fascinating.
So would that mean that things like don't walk under a ladder, or
That would
coming
be a
across
superstition.
a black cat is
Yeah.
so superstitions are elements of folklore?
Yep.
I mean, it really is just it's transmission of ideas almost. You can be as generalistic as that, you know. Interesting. Did you look back at your parents and your extended family or maybe friends and notice anyone with their own particular kind of like house rules, folklore tale? Sometimes if you ever play a game with a game of Monopoly or something with someone, you're like, what are you playing with that rule? It's like a house rules, So like, have you ever heard, particular iterations of stories that you just haven't heard, but just that's particular to certain people?
Yeah, well, I mean, my family really likes a tile game called Rummy Cube. It's kind of like the card game Gin Rummy, but it's with tiles. And we definitely have some house rules that are kind of quirky. But yeah, I mean, I didn't realize it until later, but I was surrounded by folklore as a child. I suspect most people are. But one of my elementary school friends, she told me what I now know is an urban legend. She said that her aunt and uncle drove down to Mexico, which when you're in Los Angeles, you can do. Um, I was like 8 or 9 at the time, and she said that they came back with this really cute dog that they found on the streets and really wanted to adopt. Just this like really tiny, adorable dog, like some Chihuahua blend or something. And so they loved this dog. It ate it ate at their table, it slept in their bed, and they just like named this dog. They loved it. And then one day it started acting sick and foaming at the mouth. And so they took it to the vet, and the vet said, "That's not a dog, that's a rat." And my friend told me this when I was 8 or 9, and I believed it because I was a gullible child. And now it's like, oh, well, I can look up scholarship by Jan Brunvand, who's like one of the legend experts of the world. He has a book called The Mexican Pet, named after this legend variation.
Really? Oh my goodness. So there you go. And that's, a real experience of how stories transmit. Yeah, as you might well have you heard that from a friend, and you might well have told that to other people, saying, "Oh, my friend," and then this kind of out of this kind of legend develops. And
Yep.
interesting. You might not know this. It's quite biblical, but in the story of Joshua commanding the sun stop in the sky considered folklore?
I have no idea. I don't know
Yeah,
that one. I barely
but
read the Bible.
yeah, I mean, I suppose it's sometimes. So you were saying earlier about this difference between sort of myths is that the people who believe them, you know for them it's not myth though, and for someone who believes that story of Joshua commanding the sun, it's not going to be a myth for them, and it certainly won't be folklore. But I suppose in the nature of if you're thinking back to how the Bible or how any kind of book collection of stories is brought together, you're going to have communities of people telling this story over time, and this story changing, and then eventually getting committed to paper, and then that would surely qualify as folklore, I would have thought.
Yeah, and then I mentioned earlier, like, if you do encounter something, you're like, "Is this folklore?" Look for multiple existence and variation. Like, there's more than one text running around, and there's some little, like, stylistic variations or whatever, maybe, like, little plot variables. So if you find other texts that are kind of similar to that or similar themes or motifs or whatever, it might count as folklore. I can't win at this example.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, that's so the interesting one as far as the Bible's concerned is something like the flood myth, where you
Mm.
get, the flood myth of Genesis, and then you get Epic of Gilgamesh, and then actually you've got flood myths in pretty much every culture in the world, because, as you say, they have a function. That story has a
Mhm.
function, which is to explain why floods happen.
Yeah.
And so there you go. What is what's the darkest folklore story that you can think of?
So actually I debated going into this when you asked my favorite. So one of my favorite fairy tale texts is sort of a weird variant of Cinderella. Cinderella is tale type 510A. This one is 510B. It's about a father who wants to marry his daughter. Like, he's a king and the queen has died. And when the queen is on her deathbed, she makes him promise, "You will only marry someone who is as beautiful as me, who fits my shoe, who fits my ring." There's a lot of variations. And so the queen dies and time passes. And the father looks around at some point, figures out that it's his own daughter who fits this quality. And he decides he's going to marry her. She, of course, does not want to marry her father. And so, either under the guidance of some like wise helper figure or on her own, she stalls for time by asking for a dress as gold as the sun, a dress as silver as the moon, and a dress as bright as the stars. And then, depending on the version, like in the Charles Perrault version, she asks her father to kill a donkey who shits gold and give her its skin. She then wears it and runs away and calls herself Donkey Skin. In the Grimm's version, she asks for a coat made of the furs of 1,000 animals in the forest. And she puts it on and runs away. And others, she asks for a dress made of wood. And others, like, she throws herself into a casket in a river and floats away. So basically, this girl is escaping her incestuous father by requesting weird magical dresses and garments. Ends up in the next kingdom over, where the king or the prince is throwing these balls to meet his wife. And that's where it dovetails with Cinderella. She works as a servant in the day, wears these magical dresses at night. The prince falls in love with her, and then there's some kind of like recognition token.
Interesting. So it's like
Weird one.
recognizing these motifs that exist in so many of these stories. I mean, as someone mentioned in the chat about the film Into the Woods,
Mm.
how do you feel when you watch films like that? For those who don't know, Into the Woods is a musical film, almost entirely musical, that seems to be like ticking off as many like folkloric tropes as it can. And when you watch that, is that something that excites you? Do you go, "Oh, that's not how it should be," or is it can be how it can be because that is how folklore works? Or I
Yeah, I
don't know.
mean, it's fun. I consume a lot of fairy tale media, just because I like it. But, it is kind of interesting because, like, it's not transmitted in the same way that folklore is. Like, that involves a production team and writers and customers and actors and blah, blah, blah. So it's more an artifact of pop culture than a folklore, but it is taking the folklore motifs and transforming them. So I do personally enjoy fairy tale film. One of the first articles I published in an academic journal was about the movie Shrek 2 as a kind of a pastiche of different fairy tales. I really like the film The Shape of Water. I've published a book chapter on that one too, sort of a gender bent Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast thing, which I think is really cool. So yeah, so I encounter a lot.
That's a film that's got so much great critical acclaim, and I've never watched it yet. So I will take it upon myself to do so.
But yeah, there are so many modern sort of translations and retellings and reworkings of folklore and fairy tales that I usually enjoy. I mean, sometimes they fall flat. Like I think Snow White and the Huntsman, Mirror Mirror. For some reason, 2012 was the year of the lackluster fairy tale retelling films, but mostly I enjoy them.
Yeah. Do you tell them ever? Do you think there's something about the oral performance of fairy tales? Is that important, or is it not? Is it just like...
Yeah, I mean, fairy tales are weird because they really cross between oral tradition and literature quite fluidly, more than most genres do, I think. So I do think there's really something to like the live context of storytelling that's really unique and really interesting. I am not myself that good of a tale teller. I frequently mess up the punchlines of jokes. So, there's kind of a misconception that, oh, folklorists are all good storytellers, or folklorists write children's books or whatever. Like there's all these kind of weird misconceptions. Like just because you study a thing doesn't mean you perform and you do the thing. But I do have colleagues who are professional storytellers and professional musicians who also study folk music and so on. So that is a thing for some people.
So as we sort of move to wrapping it up, and if anyone's got any questions, please get them in. As we move towards that point, where do you see your work with folklore going? What either floats your boat? What is something you want to achieve within folklore? What interests you the most? What area?
Well, now that Folklore 101 is out in the world, I'm writing the sequel, which is Fairy Tales 101. And I would love to do a series of books on kind of various major genres of folklore, just to kind of like deep dive, because Folklore 101 is like intro level, very broad, just of necessity. So I would like to keep writing. I would like to keep doing scholarships. I enjoy going to conferences, presenting papers, occasionally publishing them. But right now I'm just really enjoying the more public facing side, where it's not me having a conversation with like 8 colleagues who know the jargon I'm talking about. It's me talking to everyone and everyone talking back, because folklore is inherently democratic. So I'm really enjoying this more kind of public facing stuff right now.
Oh, that's brilliant. Well, look, if ever you want to talk about anything, anything, folklore or anything that's of interest to you, you've always got a platform here. So, I find stuff like this, fascinating because this isn't something that happens to other people. If you study another culture or something, you're like, oh, look at this other thing, or some kind of phenomenon that is just unconnected to you, and you're studying it because it's different. We are all surrounded by folklore, and we have been all our lives, and it's a part of our cultural baggage that we carry around with us, and so therefore it has meaning to us all.
Yeah,
so
I agree.
No disagreement there. So would you when it comes to so you just go full circle and back to sort of OnlySky, where you are writing at the moment. And OnlySky is a platform, for those who don't know yet, even though I've banged on about it quite a bit. It is a platform for representation and giving voice for and to the non-religious segment, particularly in America, of society. What do you think is a challenge for the non-religious, particularly in America? Why is it important to give a voice to the non-religious? What's your motivation to write at the place where you're writing?
Yes, I think in the US in particular, there is a persistent assumption that if you are not religious, you are amoral or unethical. And again, we see this in sex education so much. Like, people will try to bring someone into a school as a speaker. Religious speakers get the okay. It's like, oh, I do comprehensive scientific sex ed. It's like, oh, I don't know about that. That might offend someone. You might be putting ideas in kids' heads. So I really think this assumption that non-religious people don't have morals and don't have ethics and are dangerous is still really present. And I think that's a problem. So just having places where we can write and speak and kind of hash out, like, well, what are our ethics? What are the pros and cons of being religious or non-religious? Because I'm a feminist and I'm really interested in queer theory as well. So like, what do we gain when we take religion out of the equation? Talking about gender, talking about sexuality, all these things. I think there's a lot to be gained, and I think it's good to have a place to have these conversations.
Yeah, it's just a big project of normalization in the sense that all the great civil rights movements have been about normalizing whatever subculture you're talking about. And yet the last one that seems to still have this prejudice, although these are breaking down now, like we're in that moment of it breaking down, but these prejudice that hold on, like the polls that show that the least trusted people are atheists, or the people that you would least want to be a president would be atheists. Like, we need to break that down because it's prejudicial, and we do that by normalizing, and you normalize by shouting about stuff and by getting out there and doing this forward facing stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So have you ever experienced any sort of bias due to being an atheist or non-religious, or even like folklorist?
I don't think I have, but I've never run for public office. But I mean, I've definitely experienced bias for being a woman, for being queer, for being somewhat Jewish. Like, it's weird. It's weird. So
It's just, I don't know why that made me laugh. I get prejudice for being somewhat Jewish. It's just like this kind of, I get a bit of prejudice for being a bit Jewish. It's just, I don't know, it made me laugh.
well, it's like there are all these urban legends and conspiracy theories and rumors that are very anti-Semitic in nature about, like, the lizard people and the global conspiracy involved.
Right.
I'm just like, you realize you're talking to a Jewish person about this, right? Like, you realize this is grounded in a millennia-old tradition of believing in the blood libel, which apparently makes Jewish people murderers and in control of the lives of Christian people. And, like, you realize this, right? So I have strong feelings about
I didn't realize the connection. Now I just thought it was lizard people and but there you go. This is in itself a kind of folkloric thing. There's a meta. Well, yeah. Interesting. Anyway, look, thank you so much for the time that you spent with me and with the viewers tonight. Is there anything you would like to shout about, to say? Where can people find you? What can people, what can people rush out and buy to help you?
Yeah. Well,
Folklore
first,
101.
yeah, thanks for having me. This has been a blast. Yeah, obviously check out Folklore 101. It's available in lots of platforms, paperback, hardback, ebook, all the things. I blog at OnlySky. I have been having a fantastic time getting to know the older and new bloggers there and seeing all the columns. I am on Twitter as Foxy Folklorist. I'm on Twitter all the time, even when I shouldn't be. So come hang out and talk. And yeah, this has been great. Thank you so much.
Well, look, thank you. It's really interesting. I was thinking I really should get that folklore book, because it does. I know I'd love to read it, because in fact that fascinates me, and especially when you talk about function, I'm really interested. Whenever I think about religion and attacking religion, I'm always these days thinking about the psychology of religion, and therefore what's the function that religion has. And if you're going to replace religion and move into a post-religious society, then it's understanding the function that religion provides in order to replace that with a secular function, or indeed to get rid of it altogether. So it's understanding the functionality of all things that are in our society or in our culture. So yeah. So I think I'm going to have to go out and buy that. The only problem is, and I don't know if you have this, but and especially as someone who writes as well, is that I do so much writing that I find not enough time to read, or I read things that are pertinent to my writing out of necessity. So, and I'm diving into so many books and picking chapters and there, chapters there. I never get a chance to just sit and read things for pleasure.
Yeah, I know. My list of books on my Kindle that I either bought or got from the library and haven't read yet is just a little too much.
The very final thing, and this is how I wrap up all my talks, I hope you don't mind, which is quick fire questions, right? You are just going to hit you with some quick fire questions. You can't think about them. So, favorite non-fiction book?
Entitled by Kate Manne.
A quick description of that.
Kate Manne is a moral philosopher who talks about the entitlement that many men have for many women's emotional, sexual, and reproductive labor.
So, Entitlement by, sorry, the author?
Dr. Kate Manne.
Dr. Kate Manne. Brilliant. Favorite fiction book?
Palimpsest by Catherine Valente. It is about a sexually transmitted city.
Wow. That sounds bizarre. Interesting. If you could go and see a band that you've never seen before, either dead or alive, or who would it be?
I like music, but I am drawing a blank. Oh, I want to see Depeche Mode.
There you go. Job done.
All right.
Depeche Mode. Excellent. And if you're just about to be executed, sorry about that, but you've been given a last meal. What would your last meal be? What would your I'm gonna die, I'm gonna go out having eaten this?
I'm not a complete francophile, but I want escargot and foie gras and the best baguette ever and a lot of red wine.
It's like what French tropes can I just fit into one answer? Just like, I want snails, I want red wine, I want baguettes, and just for the record, I'm gonna have a string of onions around the neck. No, I like it. That's excellent. Favorite film?
Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. It's a classic.
Interesting. And last question. You are just about to experience an apocalypse. Let's call it a zombie apocalypse. You're just about to get your face eaten off. So you run into a bunker. You're allowed to take 3 people with you into the bunker. You're not allowed to, these are no family members or someone close to you. Just 3 random people, famous people, hopefully. Who would you take, dead or alive, into a bunker with you? For a month. You got a month with them.
I mean, actually, I'd probably want to hang out with Kate Manne, the author of Entitled, because she just seems really cool. And then one of my favorite sex educators and authors is Emily Nagoski. She's also super cool. And then I would want my folklore mentor, Alan Dundas, to come back from the dead so we could hang out.
Nice. Good choice there. That seems pretty, that's like you in intellectual and cultural heaven. You just be like, and let's talk. We got a month, guys. That sounds brilliant. Okay. Well, I thank you again for the 15th time. Everyone check out all of Dr. Jeana Jorgensen's writing and go and get her book. And thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I look forward to repeating this at some point, if that's okay with you. Final words?
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. This has been great fun.
Cool beans. Thank you. And thanks to all the viewers. Thanks for all your support.